Iran just hit Saudi Arabia, and the entire Gulf closed at once. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a decision every government in a region makes simultaneously, without coordination, without a joint statement, without a multilateral process. That silence fell across the Gulf tonight within hours of Iranian ballistic missiles. Not Houthi drones, not proxy rockets, Iranian ballistic missiles fired from Iranian territory, landing on Saudi soil. The UAE shut down its airspace. Qatar shut down its airspace. Kuwait, Bahrain, every major Gulf state made the same call. Dubai International Airport stopped accepting flights. Doha's Hamad International halted operations. Every Gulf airline grounded its fleet. Every international carrier suspended its Gulf routes. When every government in a region makes that decision independently and simultaneously, it is not panic. It is a rational calculation arriving at the same conclusion from every starting point. Every Gulf government looked at what just happened to Saudi Arabia and assessed that the threat environment had changed so severely, so suddenly, and so fundamentally that closing the airspace was less catastrophic than leaving it open. That assessment was made within hours of Iran crossing a line that this rivalry has never crossed before. Over the next several minutes, we are going to go through exactly what Iran struck, why the specific targets are more alarming than the strike itself, what the Gulf airspace shutdown means for the global economy and American military posture, and why a direct Iranian ballistic missile strike on Saudi Arabia is the single development that changes the strategic geometry of the entire Middle East. Iran and Saudi Arabia have been engaged in one of the most consequential rivalries in modern geopolitics for decades. That rivalry has been fought almost entirely through proxies. In Yemen, where Houthi forces backed by Iran have struck Saudi infrastructure repeatedly since 2015. In Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, across the Levant, where Iranian-backed militias have pursued Iranian strategic objectives while maintaining the layer of deniability that kept the rivalry below the threshold of direct state-on-state conflict. That proxy layer was not an accident. It was the essential mechanism by which both countries managed their competition without triggering consequences neither was prepared to absorb. When a Houthi drone hit Ras Tanura in 2019, Saudi Arabia could calibrate its response to the deniable proxy version of the attack. It could apply pressure to Houthi supply chains, increase air defenses, lodge diplomatic complaints, and manage the event within a framework designed for exactly that kind of provocation. The architecture of the proxy layer existed precisely to keep each incident manageable, damaging enough to advance Iranian objectives, ambiguous enough to avoid forcing a response that neither side wanted. Direct Iranian ballistic missiles fired from Iranian territory and landing on Saudi soil remove that architecture entirely. There is no deniability. There is no attribution ambiguity, no proxy, no cutout, no militant group whose relationship with Tehran can be described as complex or indirect. Iranian missiles launched from Iran landed in Saudi Arabia. Full stop. Saudi Arabia cannot manage that event through the diplomatic frameworks it has used to manage Houthi strikes for a decade. It cannot describe it as a proxy provocation, requiring a measured response calibrated to avoid direct escalation. It has to respond to an act of direct state-on-state aggression in a way that is proportional to what has actually happened. And what has actually happened has no precedent in the history of this rivalry. That requirement puts Saudi Arabia in a position it has spent 50 years of careful, expensive, exhausting diplomacy working to avoid. The question is not whether it will respond. The question is what kind of response is available to it and what that choice means for everyone else. Iran did not strike Saudi military bases in this salvo. It did not strike Saudi civilian infrastructure in the way it has struck Israeli cities throughout this conflict. It struck two categories of target that are more strategically significant than either of those options. And the combination tells you precisely what Iran was trying to achieve beyond the immediate military damage. The first category, Saudi oil infrastructure. The Ras Tanura export terminal on the eastern coast, the most important single oil export facility in the world, received impacts that disrupted export operations. In the same salvo, the Abqaiq processing facility was struck. The intelligence community has previously assessed that destruction of Abqaiq would remove approximately 5% of global daily oil supply from the market in a single event. Ras Tanura and Abqaiq were hit together. These are not targets chosen for military effect. They are targets chosen for economic effect measured on a global scale. The disruption of Ras Tanura and Abqaiq simultaneously does not just hurt Saudi Arabia. It removes production capacity from the global oil market at a moment when the Strait of Hormuz is already closed, when the IEA has already released its largest ever emergency reserve package, and when Brent crude was already trading above $100 a barrel before a single Iranian missile crossed into Saudi airspace tonight. The second category, air situational awareness infrastructure. Iran struck Saudi air traffic management facilities and radar installations covering the airspace over the eastern Arabian Peninsula. These facilities are not civilian aviation infrastructure in any ordinary sense. They are the radar and communication systems that provide the air picture over the approaches to the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, the same approaches that U.S. military aircraft use for operations throughout the theater. Their degradation reduces the air situational awareness available to American military assets operating in the region and to the Gulf states trying to monitor Iranian air activity in real time. Iran hit the Saudi oil export infrastructure and the regional military air picture infrastructure in the same salvo. The economic weapon and the military sensor simultaneously. That is not an improvised targeting decision. That is the product of a targeting plan developed over months and executed at the moment Iran assessed the strike would produce the maximum compounding effect. The sophistication of the combination, economic disruption at global scale, military sensor degradation across the theater, proxy layer removed, Saudi response forced, is the detail that every defense ministry in the world is absorbing tonight. The airspace closure picture is the dimension of this story with the most immediate and most visible impact on people far beyond the Middle East, and it is already unfolding. Dubai International handles approximately 90 million passengers annually. Its closure does not just strand passengers traveling to and from Dubai. It disrupts the routing of a significant portion of global aviation traffic that uses Gulf hubs as connecting points between Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Doha's Hamad International is Qatar Airways' home base. Qatar Airways operates one of the most extensive long-haul networks on Earth, connecting destinations across 6 continents. Its grounding does not just affect Qatar Airways passengers. It removes a major carrier from routes where it provides significant capacity, producing ripple effects through global aviation markets within 24 hours. Kuwait International Airport closed. Bahrain International Airport closed. Every major commercial aviation hub in the Gulf region made the same operational decision within the same window, not because they were told to by a coordinating authority, but because each independently concluded that keeping the airspace open was the more dangerous option. Consider what that conclusion required each government to believe. It required believing that Iranian ballistic missile activity in the region is sufficiently unpredictable and sufficiently threatening to commercial aviation that civilian aircraft in Gulf airspace face a risk level that cannot be managed through normal air traffic control procedures. That is not a conclusion any aviation authority reaches easily. Gulf aviation hubs are economic engines whose disruption costs hundreds of millions of dollars per day. The decision to close them was made within hours, which tells you more about what those governments know and believe about the current threat environment than any official statement has yet communicated. For cargo logistics, the impact compounds further. Air freight through Gulf hubs, pharmaceutical supplies, electronics components, perishable goods, just-in-time manufacturing inputs, is now disrupted on top of the maritime logistics disruption from the Hormuz closure and the Jebel Ali port strikes. Land, sea, and air logistics through the Gulf are simultaneously compromised. The global supply chain does not have a fourth option. The American military dimension of the Saudi strike is the most immediate strategic consequence for the trajectory of this conflict, and it requires specific analysis because the U.S. military's operational position in the Gulf theater has been degrading across multiple simultaneous pressure points. Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, a primary hub for U.S. air operations in the theater, was struck earlier in this conflict. 5 KC-135 Stratotanker aircraft were destroyed on the ground in that earlier strike. Tanker aircraft are the logistical backbone of sustained air operations. Their destruction directly limits the range and duration of U.S. combat air power in the theater. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the forward headquarters of U.S. Air Forces Central, the command element responsible for managing American air power across the entire Middle East region, was struck in the opening phase of this conflict. With both of those facilities already damaged and the broader Gulf airspace now closed by sovereign decisions of the host nations, the logistics architecture the United States military has been using to sustain air operations is under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. And this is the dimension that creates the strategic bind. Every Gulf government that has been providing basing and overflight access for American operations is now managing a direct Iranian attack on a neighboring Gulf state in a dramatically changed threat environment. The calculation each of those governments was making before tonight, how much support to provide the U.S.-Israel coalition before becoming a direct Iranian target, just had its key variable updated. Saudi Arabia followed the logic of proximity to American operations and got direct Iranian ballistic missiles on its soil tonight. Every other Gulf government is watching that outcome and recalculating. The American response is constrained in ways it was not at the beginning of this conflict. Degraded basing access, consumed interceptor stockpiles, exhausted emergency petroleum reserves, and now a Saudi Arabia that requires a response framework nobody has fully designed. The administration's escalation management parameters were calibrated to a version of this conflict that no longer exists. Before this morning, Brent crude was already trading above $100 a barrel. Dubai crude was above $150. The IEA had already authorized its largest ever emergency reserve release, 400 million barrels, and oil prices had barely responded. The global oil market had already priced in the Hormuz closure, the previous Saudi infrastructure disruptions, and the cascading supply chain damage from the Jebel Ali port strikes. It had priced all of that in and was still above $100. Tonight, Iran struck Ras Tanura and Abqaiq simultaneously. The specific significance of Abqaiq is not widely understood outside the energy sector, and it needs to be stated clearly. Abqaiq processes approximately 7% of global daily oil supply. The Hormuz closure has already removed a significant fraction of Gulf export capacity from the market. The Ras Tanura and Abqaiq strikes have now disrupted Saudi production and export capacity. The Gulf airspace closure has disrupted the logistics networks that energy companies use to manage their regional operations. And the oil market does not have a price ceiling available to it when the supply disruption reaches this scale, while the IEA's emergency capacity has already been deployed. The IRGC stated at the beginning of this conflict that it was targeting $200 per barrel. That statement was widely characterized as bravado, the maximalist public position of a military organization trying to project strength. Tonight's arithmetic suggests it was a planning objective with a specific operational sequence designed to achieve it. Hormuz Phase 1, Saudi Infrastructure Phase 2, Compounding Disruption Phase 3. The $200 figure is not Iran's ceiling after tonight. It may be the floor the market finds when it opens tomorrow morning after absorbing the full scope of what has been struck. Apply that oil price to everything downstream: global manufacturing input costs, agricultural logistics, heating and cooling for residential and commercial consumers across the northern hemisphere entering summer, industrial operations in every economy that has not secured alternative energy supply contracts. The governments managing those downstream effects are managing them while also managing the political consequences of fuel prices that have no modern precedent outside the 1973 embargo. And that embargo lasted months before its political cost forced a resolution. This one has no resolution framework currently visible. The deepest strategic dimension of the Saudi strike is not the military damage or the oil market disruption. It is the position Iran has put Saudi Arabia in, and the fact that both available Saudi responses serve Iranian interests. Option 1. Saudi Arabia responds militarily against Iran. Riyadh is not capable of conducting independent military operations against Iran at scale. Saudi military action against Iran would require American support, American logistics, American air power, American intelligence. It would pull Saudi Arabia into formal alignment with the U.S.-Israel coalition on terms that require the United States to commit assets and support to defending and enabling a Saudi military campaign against Iran. That deepens American military involvement at a moment when American military logistics in the theater are already under pressure and when the American domestic political cost of deeper involvement is rising with every oil price increment. Option 2, Saudi Arabia does not respond militarily and absorbs the strike within a political framework of measured condemnation. That response signals to the region, and to every Gulf government watching, that direct Iranian ballistic missile strikes on Gulf states produce only diplomatic consequences. That signal is more destabilizing to Gulf security architecture than the Saudi military option because it tells every Gulf state that the deterrence framework it has been relying on to keep Iran's direct aggression bounded does not apply to them either. Iran's calculation appears to be that the strike either deters deeper Saudi military cooperation with the U.S.-Israel coalition by demonstrating the concrete cost of that cooperation, or pulls Saudi Arabia into the coalition on terms that expose Riyadh to further escalation and expand the conflict to a scale that increases economic pain on the parties best positioned to force a ceasefire. Either outcome advances Iranian strategic interests compared to Saudi Arabia, remaining in the ambiguous position it had been occupying. Passive support for U.S. operations without formal coalition alignment. Iran removed that ambiguity tonight. Saudi Arabia now has to choose, and there is no option available to it that doesn't carry significant cost. Every previous escalatory step in this conflict produced a version of the same question. Is there any target Iran is not willing to strike? Every time that question was asked, after Tel Aviv, after the IDF headquarters, after Dubai, after the American military bases, the answer the evidence produced was the same. Tonight, that question arrives with Saudi Arabia as the answer to its own previous iteration. The country that spent decades maintaining the most carefully engineered position of managed rivalry in the region, that cultivated the proxy layer as a mutual off-ramp, that built its security architecture on the premise that direct Iranian aggression would cross a threshold neither side would choose to cross, that country just absorbed direct Iranian ballistic missiles on its most important economic infrastructure. The oil market question and the security question are now the same question. How long can the governments of major economies manage the political consequences of oil prices at levels that have no modern precedent, while the supply disruptions producing those prices have no resolution mechanism currently in operation? The IEA's reserves are deployed. The strategic petroleum reserves of the United States are committed. The adaptive workarounds, Dubai's port, Dubai's financial infrastructure, have been struck. The air situational awareness over the Gulf approaches has been degraded. The American military logistics architecture in the theater is under pressure from multiple simultaneous directions. The answer to how long is measured in weeks, not because any military objective will be achieved in weeks, but because the political cost curves of every government involved, including the governments that have been watching from what they believed was a safe distance, converge on a point where the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of accepting terms. What those terms look like, who is positioned to propose them, and whether any party in this conflict currently has the incentive structure to accept them, that is the question that determines everything that follows. And nobody has answered it yet. What everyone has this morning is a Saudi Arabia that just absorbed direct Iranian fire, a Gulf with no functioning airspace, an oil market with no ceiling in sight, and a conflict that has methodically eliminated every geographic and economic assumption of safety that anyone anywhere was relying on to stay outside it.